When I was 19, I was looking for a room to rent in the city I was moving to for college. It was about an hour away from my family. I wasn't having much luck, and my mom started helping me look for a place. She found an ad on Craigslist for a room for $300 in a house, everything included. The homeowner was a man, and he rented the additional rooms upstairs to other women while he lived in the finished basement. The ad stated he rarely ever saw the other roommates because he had a kitchen and his own entrance downstairs, and that he preferred women because he had issues with male roommates in the past partying and causing damage. We decided to take a look since it was the cheapest that we could find in the area. My mom and I went to the house to view it. Decent house, decent neighborhood. He opened the door and was very welcoming. He was middle-aged and the kitchen and living room were furnished nicely and clean. My mom loves to talk and get to know people, so they were engaged in conversation while I stood there quietly and observed the place. He then said he would show me my room. We head towards the staircase to go up, as I thought, since he said on the phone my room was upstairs with the other roommates, but he opens another door and we follow. He takes us down to the basement and opens a door to a very small room, no closet and no windows. He proceeds to say this is my room and I will be sharing the bathroom in the hallway with him, and his bedroom did not have a door on it. I was definitely thinking absolutely not, this is weird, but they were so deep in conversation that I couldn't interject. He then leads us to the upstairs and shows us the other rooms which the doors were open and says they are currently rented. He then starts telling us elaborate stories about the other women, not very nice stories describing drinking problems. My mom was listening intently, but I took the time to investigate further. I looked in all 3 rooms and the bathrooms. There was furniture, but not a single item in there that looked like it belonged to a woman, no clothes or anything, only men's clothes in one of the closets. He had no problem with me creeping around his tenants' rooms without their permission. I then heard him tell my mom that he has some of his stuff in their closets, but they don't mind. I was feeling really uncomfortable and started moving them back downstairs as they talked. My mom had mentioned when we arrived that her and my dad were going on vacation the next week, but I couldn't go because I had to work. He brought it up again, and that I should come by the next week and have dinner with him and the roomies to see if we would all get along. I said sure, and we left. As soon as we got in the car, I told my mom I would definitely not be living there. She was dumbfounded. I had to explain to her not only did he lie about the room I would be in, that I was not supposed to be in the basement with him as well as share a bathroom with him, and he didn't even have a damn door, but also did she not notice how no one else even lived there? She still didn't get it and thought I was just being paranoid and thought he was nice and it was a cheap deal. I had to explain it to my stepdad and get him to tell her by no means would I be living there. I tried to report the post, but by the time we got home that day, he removed it. I think he planned on murdering me at dinner, or abducting me and holding me hostage in that basement room that had no way to escape. When I was 21 years old, I broke up with my first ever serious girlfriend, with whom I had been together for 8 months. Needless to say, I was devastated. I fell into a deep depression. I began abusing painkillers and Xanax really heavily, and I began looking for any chick I could find to rebound with. I ended up looking on the personal section on Craigslist and found an ad for a girl named Stephanie. I began talking to her and I arranged for her to come pick me up one night. We had intercourse that night and decided to make it a regular thing. She was an older lady, about 35, and a bigger girl, but she had her own apartment and enough money to keep me loaded on as much drugs and alcohol as I wanted. To be honest, I kind of used this lady and used her as my sugar mama for lack of a better word. After a while, she grew really attached to me and started to want a more serious relationship. Eventually, she started dropping hints about wanting to get married. She said she wanted to do this to help me out so she could get me on her insurance so I can get help for my drug and alcohol problem, which I refused to consider. One day we got into a big argument and she told the police that I had been abusing her and got a temporary restraining order on me. A week after she did this, she called me crying her eyes out saying, "Please forgive me, I love you," and all this other stuff, and said she wanted to come pick me up, buy me some dope and alcohol, and get me something to eat. Being the addict I am, I of course accepted. From the moment she picked me up, I noticed that she was acting kind of odd. She was usually really talkative and was always on my ass wanting to talk to me about this and that, but on this day she was oddly quiet. When we got back to her apartment, after I walked in, she immediately pushed me on the couch and pulled my pants down and began giving me head. I had been getting bad vibes off of her the whole night, so after this happened, I immediately asked her for a ride back home, which she quickly agreed to do. About 10 minutes after I was home, I got a call on the phone. I picked up the phone, and to my surprise, a lady on the other end said, This is the St. Louis County Police Department. We're going to need you to come outside to talk to you." I ran downstairs, hid my weed and my pills, and then walked outside to figure out what the hell was going on. When I walked outside, there were about 7 different cops on my porch, and they were all pointing tasers and guns at me. One of them hit me in the back of my leg with a nightstick and put me on the ground, and I was handcuffed. The cops then talked to my mom and got permission to go inside of the house, where they took a drug dog and began doing a thorough search of my room and my basement area. None of the cops on the scene would tell me what was going on. Whenever I would ask a question about why they were there, they told me I would have to talk to the detective at the station. When I got to the police station, I had a bombshell dropped on me. Apparently, this lady had accused me of kidnapping and raping her. She told the police that she had come by my house to return some of my stuff because we had just broken up, and that I had come out, held a knife to her throat, and forced my way into her vehicle, taking her back to her apartment and raping her repeatedly. Thankfully, I had remembered that we made a couple of stops on the way to her apartment. She had gone inside of a gas station to get a couple packs of cigarettes with me, so there was no way that I could have kidnapped her. The police still swabbed my dick for DNA, and they also took my clothes for evidence, and I was forced to spend the night in the St. Louis County Jail wearing nothing but hospital scrubs. I was released the next morning, but my ordeal was far from over. This lady began constantly stalking me. She would call me every night at odd times from blocked numbers and either begin crying into the phone or just beg to talk to me. I also began seeing her vehicle quite a lot in the neighborhood, even though she lives nowhere close to me. I called the police about this a couple of times, but they didn't really seem to care. They told me I would have to go get a restraining order on her in order to make it stop. I wanted nothing to do with the court system though, because I have a criminal record, and I just decided to ignore her and hope that the problem would go away. After a couple of months, she finally did stop bothering me. However, to this day, sometimes I get calls at 2 or 3 in the morning from blocked numbers, and every new girlfriend I get, she messages them on Facebook and tells them how I raped her.
I used to work as an event coordinator at the Swan and Dolphin Resort/Convention Center. Sometimes we'd have to get there at really early hours of the day before the union laborers showed up. This was to get everything ready and set up for special events and stuff like that. One day, one of my managers had cut my hours due to a budget decline in the company. This resulted in me not making as much money as I used to, which caused me to fall behind on rent. Therefore, I had to start making some money until I could either get more hours or find a new job. Eventually, I began to sell some items on sites like Craigslist and eBay, which added to my income. It wasn't much, but it was enough to financially support myself through this time. At the time, I was in the process of selling a specific type of radio from the 40s that was worth a pretty penny. It was my grandpa's radio, and I guess it somehow got passed on to me after he died. I've gotten several offers for it, but the majority of them were people trying to lowball me for prices too small. At one point, however, I get a message from a guy who seemed really interested in it, who was willing to offer me $500 for it, which was more than the listed price. I of course accepted the offer, and he then told me that he could come after 5 after he got off work. This was actually better for me, as I'd be out until 4. Anyway, 5 p.m. rolls around, and a few minutes after, I get a knock at the door and open it. Standing at my doorstep is an older-looking man, maybe late 50s, tall, with a long gray beard. To describe him a little better, he looked like a biker you'd commonly see in country movies. In a very deep and raspy voice, he says, "Hey there, I'm here for that radio?" I happily let him in and show him the radio sitting on the kitchen table, and even got him a snack. Oddly enough, he immediately begins inspecting the condition of it, and even went as far as checking the inside. After what felt like forever, he puts it down and says he'd do it for $300 as the condition wasn't the best. Needless to say, of course, that $500 deal was out the window. He then stares at me with this intimidating look where I felt like I didn't have a choice. In the end, I had to agree and did the deal with him right then. Mind you, I'm a petite 5'7" girl, so I wasn't going to try and argue with someone like him. He gives me the money, puts the radio in his car, thanks me, and drives off. I wasn't sure why, but something about him just gave off a negative vibe, which made me glad he was gone. The rest of the night was normal, where I had been watching a movie in my bed when my phone rang. The call was coming from an unknown number, but the area code was the same. Without thinking much of it, I pick up and immediately recognize the voice on the other end. It was the man from earlier calling me to thank me. What he said, however, will forever be burned into the back of my mind.
Hey Sally, look, thank you so much for your hospitality and kindness. If I'm being completely honest with you, I was planning to kill you with a knife I had in my back pocket the second I walked into your house. But you were just so kind, I just couldn't pull myself to do it. Take care now.
Right then, my mouth draped open as humanly possible with all these thoughts racing through my mind. If I'm being honest with you, I wasn't sure what to do other than to process as to what I just heard. I would have called the police, but I later found out that the number he was using was fake from an app. That basically meant that even if police were to track the number, it wouldn't lead to him. After that, I removed the listing from Craigslist and never touched the site again. As scary as this was, I never received any updates on his identity or if he's in jail or not. There are seriously some crazy people out in the world who are willing to do anything to you. I emphasize that you please be careful when selling or buying something from sites like Craigslist. You never know who's out there and what they're capable of. This happened when I was in my mid-20s back in 2012 when I was living in Sarasota, Florida. I had just graduated from college and had gotten a job in IT as a software engineer at a really good company. Because of this job, I was able to move out of my parents' house and get an apartment. It wasn't big, but it was spacious enough where I could store most of my stuff. When moving out, odds are you'd probably have a few items left over that you no longer needed or wanted. Well, I had the same situation and had some things I didn't need that I put up for sale on Craigslist. At the time, Craigslist was booming in popularity where people were buying and selling left and right. One of the items I had listed was this large tote I had used back when I played sports. It was in pretty good condition, and I figured I'd snag a deal on it since sports were popular in my town. I'd say within a day, I had gotten a message from someone nearby interested in the tote. He seemed nice, didn't live too far, and was willing to pay more than what I was listing it for. Being so close to me, he'd offered to just meet me at my apartment, which would make for a smoother transaction. I'll be honest, I was a little uncomfortable, knowing that him, a complete stranger, would know where I lived. That being said, I brushed it off and told him I'd do it. Later that night, I hear a knock at the door and was greeted to a man who looked to be in his mid-30s with this Swedish accent. He immediately goes to hug me, telling me that it was a nice way of saying hello in Sweden. Being a gay guy, I didn't really mind it and thought it was a kind gesture. He hugs me for a good 10 seconds before letting go and asking me for the tote. I gladly give it to him, and he then proceeds to pull out a $100 bill and hands it to me, making sure our hands touched. It was a little uncomfortable, but I dismissed it as something people always did in Sweden. He thanks me, hugs me again, and walks down the hallway to the exit. Now let's fast forward till about 2 days later. I happened to be sick on this day and had called off work to rest. As I'm taking a nap in my room, I hear a heavy knocking on my door, which abruptly awoke me. I opened the door and was greeted to 2 police officers and the property manager. Confused, I asked what was going on, to which they then asked if I knew this person. The property manager showed me a photo of a man on his phone who just so happened to be the guy I had sold the tote to. I tell them yes and explained that I had sold him a bag, but that was all I ever knew about him. They take down my name, my description of him, and what he ever said to me or did to me. Whenever I asked why they needed that information, they informed me that they couldn't tell me as of now. That being said, they leave, and it wasn't until a few days later where I had finally gotten my answer. Turns out, the man I had sold the bag to had been wanted for owning 23 terabytes of CP. To put that in perspective, a single terabyte is equivalent to 1,000 gigabytes. This meant that he had about 13,000 hours of content downloaded. When I was told this, I was beyond disgusted, knowing I was talking to a predator, a wanted predator in my home. The tote I had sold him was to keep certain documents that contained information on how to cover his tracks. Obviously, this plan never went through, as he did end up getting caught in the end. I was interviewed for about a week by police before my complete shock slowly got back to normal. After that, I deleted my entire Craigslist account and decided to not sell anything else. Anyway, that's my story, and I hope you can take this as a learning opportunity to never trust people online. Before I begin with my story, I want to point out that this isn't the type of story to make you jump out of your seat. This is, however, a very real and traumatizing story for me. To preface this, I'm a female, currently 18 years old, and live on a ranch in a very secluded small town in rural Iowa. It mostly consists of multiple farms, lands, fields, etc. I've lived there my whole life and even met some of the people in my town who were very respectful, as it's a quiet little town. I won't mention the name of it as I don't want this getting out there, but it has a population of about 2,000 people. This happened during the summer of 2021 and is by far the most horrifying thing that's ever happened to me. For context, I work at a gun store in my town, which is very safe for the most part. However, I always bike to and from work, as both my parents worked late nights in the city and couldn't get me until later in the night. Well, one day, my bike had been stolen by someone from the rack right outside of the shop when I wasn't paying attention. I was obviously pissed because of this and didn't bother contacting the sheriff, as they really didn't care what happened around here. Most of the time, they wouldn't take thefts seriously and either half-assed investigated them or claimed that they didn't have enough evidence. With the police no longer being an option, I called my dad telling him the situation, and he said he'd come by to get me after work. On the way home that day, he's giving me a lecture throughout the whole car ride about how I was careless. That night, I had been on my computer searching through Craigslist to see if I could find an affordable bike to buy. I didn't need a super expensive bike, just one that would get me from point A to point B. Within 20 minutes, I had found one that seemed like a steal. It was a standard bike that seemed to be in great condition and was only $70. The seller was only 15 miles away from the nearest city, so it was a long drive, but it would be worth it. My parents had been at work that night, and with no car, I had taken an Uber to the drop-off spot. When my ride had dropped me off, I noticed a black van parked on the side of the road with its lights turned off. It was the only vehicle in the area, so I could only assume that was him. I messaged the seller, asking if that was him in the van, to which he then said yes and to come over. I ever so slowly walk over towards the driver's side when I see a man roll down his window and introduced himself as Jeff. He had claimed that he was the one selling the bike and that it was in the back of the van. He then tells me I could go ahead and open the doors and just grab the bike. I then thought to myself as to why he wasn't doing it, and when I asked him this, he said that he had a bad knee and that it hurt to walk. Not wanting to pry and too tired to care, I proceeded to walk towards the back of the van where the bike was. As I'm about to open the doors, I can see very faintly from the window a man wearing a vendetta mask staring back at me. The second I noticed him, I instantly knew that this wasn't some exchange and there was definitely no bike. Not making it obvious I noticed him, I told the driver that I didn't need the bike anymore and that he could go. However, I was afraid if he had known I had seen someone else back there and tried my best to stay calm. I start running towards a nearby Walmart when the driver tries negotiating that he'd lower the price. But no matter what he said, I still ignored him, hoping he'd just go away as I knew there was no bike. I approached the Walmart, and that's when the van immediately drives away, disappearing into the night. From there, I had spoken with security about the incident, and that's when they had called the police. At that point, I explained where I was, what I did, and what was said. As you could imagine, the listing had been taken down, and I never saw it again. I was unable to give a good description of the van, other than the fact that it was black with windows. I had assumed the cops would tell my parents about this, but given that I was 18, the cops couldn't inform them without my consent. I had Ubered back to my house safely, with thankfully nobody following me. Till this day, I'm still unsure as to what that man's intentions were, but they obviously weren't good. I advise anyone thinking to use Craigslist to not do it, as it's not only sketchy but also dangerous. And for those of you who are gonna do it, I emphasize you please bring someone else along with you. It may just save your life.
This happened about a year ago. I'm a college student and I was basically forced to move out on my own, which I didn't mind, but that meant finding a new roommate, which can be a daunting and scary experience. I've had a few weird encounters, but I think this one takes the cake. I posted an ad on Craigslist looking for a bedroom in a shared house or apartment for $300 or less, and on my ad I mentioned, please no phone calls, only texts or email, because I find being on the phone with someone I haven't had a chance to size up a really uncomfortable situation. I'm just awkward, I guess. Anyway, I got a call from a dude who clearly didn't read the no calls part, which I mentioned because this type of phone call was exactly the reason I don't like to talk to strangers on the phone. At first, he was just pleasant and normal, told me he had a room available and relevant information like that. We started to talk about when and where we'd meet, and he started going on tangents about random stuff. I'm in a combination of too interested in deep conversation and too awkward to end the call when it started to get weird. So this call went on for 2 hours, and we talked about the meaning of life and all kinds of weird stuff like that. Honestly, this should have been the red flag, and I shouldn't have met him. And of course, I also should have grown a pair and told him I needed to leave. So he wants me to meet him at his place and show me the room. I've since learned that you should really insist on meeting in public first. I got to his neighborhood and it was run down on a level that made the ghetto I grew up in look nice. Saggy front porches, hot cracked concrete, sad people with old beat-up Lincolns. You get the picture. His house blended right in. The yard was seriously overgrown and the front door didn't work. I went around the back and just looking at the guy standing in the doorway and seeing the kitchen behind him was enough to make me realize I really just wanted to leave. No way in hell. The guy in the doorway was a man with a sort of clown-style afro. He was leaning on a cane on his right side. His eyes looked crazy, and the house smelled musty from 10 feet away. Again, I'm a coward, so instead of trusting my gut, I go inside, and I'm polite thinking, it's okay, it'll be over in 20 minutes and I can get out. I don't know what made me think this man who had a 2-hour conversation with me on the phone about life and philosophy would let me get away that easily. He took me up a flight of creaky steps into a small bedroom with no door and a mattress on the floor. I thought no way in hell would I live with a 40-something years old man and no door on my bedroom. But it wasn't a moot point because my mind was made up before I even saw the room. I wouldn't have lived there for free, let alone for $200 a month. Things got weird. He tried to hold me hostage with conversation again. I think he was lonely. He talked about how some of his family were millionaires. He might have been delusional. The whole story seemed made up. Then he told me about an 18-year-old girl that has also checked out the room and tried to fuck him. And told me about how his mom hated white people. He was black, I was white. And it sounded like he sympathized with her. Obviously, that was super uncomfortable. Eventually, I was able to find a break in conversation and plucked up the courage to make up an excuse to leave. I was never so happy to leave a place in my life. I don't know if he was necessarily a rapist or anything, but he really gave me the creeps.
Last year, I broke my leg and was unable to do a lot of things that I typically do. I live alone in a smaller house, and my friends and family were really nice in helping me out when I first got the crutches. Soon after, though, I realized that I would have to do yard work, and I didn't want to ask family or friends to do it. Everybody in my neighborhood takes great pride in their yards. The lawns are all very green and trimmed often. There's generally nice flowers in most as well. I have a typical garden, just some basic flowers by the house, and then most of my front yard is just grass that I cut weekly. I decided to go on Craigslist to find somebody to keep up my yard for a few weeks until I would be able to again. There was only 3 weeks until I would be able to do yard work, and I didn't want to hire a company because I knew that would be really expensive. I found an ad on Craigslist that said, "Male just graduated from high school, looking to earn money doing odd jobs during summer." He even listed yard work in the ad, and I figured this would be a good person to go with. I contacted the kid, whose name was Michael. He responded saying that he was excited to have a job for a few weeks, and I told him he would come over once a week. The job would be cutting the grass and watering the flowers, also cutting down weeds if there were any, and picking up sticks in the yard. Probably would only take an hour or two each week. The next week, Michael arrived at my house, and I went outside to greet him. Right away, though, things seemed strange. Michael did not appear to be in high school at all. He had a full beard for starters, and I know some high schoolers can grow full beards, but he just didn't look 18 or 19. More like 29 or 30. Right away, I said to Michael that I thought he said he had just graduated high school. He looked confused for a moment and then said that he looks a little older than he actually is. He admitted that he hadn't just graduated, but claimed he forgot to change his ad for a few years. More like 10 years, I thought. Still, he looked capable of doing the work, and he was already here, so I gave him the information that he needed, and he started working. I went inside and went over some work stuff. I was working part-time at home and part-time in the office at the time. Occasionally, I would glance out the window to see what Michael was doing. The first day went pretty well. He did all of the maintenance work in about an hour, and then I paid him, and he left. The next week was a bit different. There was the same amount of work to be done, if not less, but he was there for almost 3 hours. I wasn't quite sure why he took so long, because I wasn't paying him by the hour. But finally, he finished, I paid him, and he left. The next week, which was the last one, he was there for a lengthy amount of time again, and this time, I noticed him poking around some of the windows and areas of my house from the outside. I really didn't know what he was doing. Cleaning the windows was not part of the job. That's seemingly what he was doing, though. I was careful not to let him notice me when I watched him work, but seeing this was a little confusing. At last, he was done, and I paid him for the final time, and he left. I was glad to be done working with Michael. He was a little strange and definitely misrepresented himself. But that same night, at about midnight, I was still awake and on my phone in my bedroom. I'm a bit of a night owl, and I frequently stay up past midnight. I heard the sound of a window opening at the opposite end of my house. Immediately, I knew what was happening. I just knew it had to be Michael. Looking back, I could have been wrong, but I had more than a hunch. I didn't know what he wanted or what he was trying to do, but when I suddenly heard footsteps coming into the house, I knew I had to do something. I stepped out into my hallway, just a couple of steps. Then, I shouted as loud as I could that I knew it was Michael and I had a gun. I didn't have a gun, but I wanted to scare him off. It actually worked, and I heard footsteps moving back until I heard noises around the window again. I left my room and walked into the living room to see an open window. I went to the front of my house and saw what sure enough appeared to be Michael running out of the front yard and onto the street. I made sure that all of my windows and doors were closed, then I went back to bed. The next day, I went to the police with all of my information. It was not difficult at all for them to find Michael because his ad was still on Craigslist. I'm glad I was awake that night when he tried breaking in, or I'm not sure what would have happened.